Defined with Rachel Hudish. I'm Dr. Robin Sargent, owner of Idle Courses, and this is the place where newbies come to learn and veterans share their knowledge. In this episode, I'll be chatting with Rachel Hudish about the jargon and industry terms that are used in instructional design. We'll be sharing stories, analogies, and definitions to illuminate the meaning of each word and term. I have with me here today Rachel Hudish, and she is an instructional designer and online learning developer. She has several different jobs, so Rachel, I'm going to let you describe what all those jobs are that you do and all the many hats that you wear and kind of your experience. But what we're going to talk about today is just all the jargon and the terms that are used in instructional design and online learning that you hear that are just thrown around and used casually, and people talk about these things as if everyone knows what they're talking about. But because this is for newbies, we decided that maybe we just come together and break them down. So Rachel, before we get into the jargon terms or the industry words, why don't you introduce yourself to our learners and tell us what it is that you do and kind of how you became an instructional designer.
Hey guys, I'm Rachel. Thanks for Robin for having me here today. So my career path, I started out in the world of video and TV production at AccuWeather before I transitioned to Penn State, where I kind of started my career path as an instructional designer. So through many twists and turns, I ended up becoming an instructional designer and an LMS administrator. So I've worked on content development, instructional design, multimedia, and of course, LMS administration. So that's kind of me in a nutshell, my 10-second elevator pitch.
You said you went through lots of twists and turns. How did you make that when did you get your first job where you had the title instructional designer or online learning developer, whatever?
So when I was at Penn State, I came into the College of Science and we had a very small team. My director at the time decided to go with a team that was very diverse. So she wanted videographers, multimedia specialists, but she was the only instructional designer. So I started playing around in our CMS, which we were using Drupal at the time, to kind of house all of our learning content and handling our assessments in a separate LMS. So I just started picking up all of these things. And so I decided that I was going to go to grad school while I was working and get my master's in instructional systems. So my husband just happened to get a job in the DC area. So that was, my first real chance to make that career change from being a videographer who was playing as an instructional designer to actually being hired at a company to be an instructional designer. And then as, since I went to federal and government training, just a lot of how the political climate was at the time, we went through reductions in force. So I just started picking up more and more hats, such as multimedia, because that's what my background was in, and then picking up Blackboard system administration. And last summer, I migrated us from the Blackboard learning management system to Desire to Learn.
Okay, awesome. I know that everybody loves to hear the story about where you came from. So we collaborated together and we decided to kind of group the different jargon terms into higher levels. So our first one that we're going to start with is online learning, right?
Yeah.
And so some of the things that you hear are a lot of acronyms. So we're going to break those down. So we got WBT, CBT, e-learning, online learning, and mobile learning.
Yep. Which we were laughing at the beginning because I said, this could be a whole podcast on its own. But then, as Robin pointed out, really at this stage in the game, they've really all kind of mean very similar things.
Right. So WBT is web-based training. CBT is computer-based training. And then e-learning, right? That is
Mm-hmm.
usually when people talk about e-learning, if you're going to define e-learning, it has to do with somebody used an authoring tool to wrap up a package of information and then put it online. So that's usually what people are talking about. And then online learning, well, that can take, it's, if you're learning online, like a webinar can be considered online learning. And then mobile learning, what, that's just the same thing as online, except for it's like on your phone.
Yeah, or like mobile, as in like, you can go anywhere. There was like this whole like Swedish study about like kids getting these devices and going around a museum as like a scavenger hunt, and that was considered mobile learning.
Right, absolutely. And then also mobile learning might even be more like, instead of just a web page that you're learning from, you're learning from an app.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So the next one is authoring tools. That's something that we hear a lot about in online learning.
Authoring tools, they're software used to package up multimedia, usually for online delivery. The star examples are Adobe Captivate and Adobe or Articulate Storyline are pretty much examples of authoring tools.
Yeah, and I always like to say that Articulate Storyline is basically PowerPoint on crack. So you still use the same functions of creating slides, and they're even called slides in Articulate Storyline, but you can add more interaction. So you can add hotspots, which you can do in PowerPoint, but you can add hotspots that then have triggers that do other fancy things like light boxes, or layers can come in and move, or you can, add a value to a variable in your project. I don't want to get too complicated. It's not that complicated as it sounds when you say variables and triggers and whatever, but it's just basically PowerPoint on crack, and very similar with Captivate, except for theirs is it's a little more clunky, and you can even import PowerPoints into Articulate Storyline and Captivate.
Yeah, I always like the analogy of like when you're trying to compare, like Adobe and Articulate both have Presenter, which is like kind of their plugin for PowerPoint. Is, everybody's like, well, when would you use one versus the other? It really just depends. Like, think of it as like a pickup truck. Do you need a truck that's gonna pull like a boat, or do you need a truck that's gonna pull like a house? So really, when you're like getting into like the nuts and bolts of like your development, thinking about what you need your authoring tool to be able to do. Like if you're doing like all these really dynamic branch scenarios, like you would want to use something like Captivate or Storyline. But if you're just trying to make like a really dynamic interactive presentation, then going with something like Presenter or a SlideShare or something like that might be a little bit easier to use.
Excellent. Okay, that's good. So we all know what authoring tools are. We know what online learning is and all those different terms. How about this term that you hear a lot called 508 compliance?
Ooh, 508 compliance. Kind of the bane of every instructional designer. It basically means that, from the U.S. Workforce Rehabilitation Act in 1973, which is a federal law, all electronic and information technology has to adhere to being accessible to people with disabilities. It goes beyond just supporting the blind or deaf and hard of hearing. It also seeks to support people with physical, sensory, or cognitive disabilities. For example, navigation like buttons and tabs and fonts need to be accessible for visual impairment, such as color blindness or low vision. So both in color and then in high contrast. So high contrast is when like you flip your browser to be in like in black mode versus, usually the bright white mode. Some people just have different visual acuity.
Have you had to do any 508 compliance? I have been an instructional designer for like 12 years, and I've never had anybody request this of me. How about you?
Yes. I have actually, because I've worked for academic institutions and in federal and government training, I've had to create captions and transcripts. I've had to make sure that HTML code is 508 compliant so that when a screen reader goes through, it'll read it a specific way to make it easier for the navigation for the user. And then updating like colors within a system, because if they don't contrast well on each other, or if you have like a button that's red and the text is green, somebody with color blindness might not be able to distinguish that because it's just going to look like a giant brown dot.
Right. And 508 compliance, a lot of that heavy lifting is done in authoring tools, but also if you do it for university curriculum, I remember that in the blueprint, if I wanted to include an image, I had to also include the alternative text for that image. Yeah. So those kinds of things are included in 508 compliance. Okay, so since we were talking about authoring tools, we also have to talk about SCORM. You hear SCORM a lot. A lot of people talk about SCORM as as if everybody knows what that is, but that is just not the case. And that is the shareable content object reference model. So do you want to talk about SCORM?
So SCORM, so since I work in federal and government training primarily, SCORM's a DoD initiative. I think it came out of it came out of the Department of Defense, but I think it was Navy that pushed it through. I could be completely wrong here.
I read that too.
But so they pushed it out as a way of, basically it takes your learning object and packages it up to gather the data interaction with the learning content. So how users are interacting with the content within the system. So if you put in a Captivate item, they want it packaged up in SCORM so that they can get the data of like how long a user stayed on a page, how many of the users got a certain question wrong. It's kind of like, how you're building out an LMS and you might go in and review a quiz to see, 20% of my students got this one question correct, whereas 80% got it wrong. So do I need to address this in the content? Do I need to follow up with these students to make sure that they're understanding the materials? That's really what we're trying to gather here from the SCORM, is that different interaction data.
Yeah, that's right. And a lot of times the SCORM package looks like a little package whenever you hit publish on your authoring tool, and then you have these options, and it'll say SCORM 1.2, or it'll say Tin Can API, or SCORM 2004. And based on your learning management system will determine usually what kind of package you publish your e-learning course to. And then you'll go to the learning management system and you will just like any kind of other file, you just drag and upload it to your learning management system. It sounds a lot more fancy than the tech is, of course. I'm sure that's all very fancy, but as far as like the actual physical actions to publish to a SCORM file and load on a learning management system is not very difficult. And I just want to make that clear to people who think, oh, that sounds so intimidating, but it's not. It's very easy. You're just uploading a file.
Yep.
Okay.
So then next, I think we have the learning management system.
LMS.
Which is one of my favorites. So an LMS is a software application that's used to administer, track, and report and deliver training. These are your Blackboard, Canvas, D2L, Moodle, Schoology, just to name a few. You can also build them out using a content management system like Drupal is used widely at Penn State. They use the Elms plugin, so it's an e-learning management system. So this basically, it makes it so that you can automatically add your learners, enroll them in the appropriate courses, roll out exams, issue certificates, and access the data reports.
That's right. And it's very important in corporate training, and of course in university settings, is to track learner behavior, right? We don't know if somebody took a course or if they've met compliance requirements unless we are able to track what they are doing. And the only real way to do that is through an LMS. And also an LMS allows for people to, oh shoot, I lost my train of thought. I know what it is.
LMS.
The other beauty about an LMS is that they can start where they left off. So there's like the administrative functions of an LMS where you can track everything and push things out to learners. But when a learner comes back to learning management systems, if they're good ones, then they can start back over where they left off. So they can like leave a program and then come back and that video will start where they last left off, or they'll start in the e-learning course or the SCORM package where they left off instead of having to skip through things.
Right. Or they'll also be able to like monitor their own notifications. So if they want to get emails when they're reaching their deadlines, they can set up their notifications so that it automatically sends them like a reminder. There's also ways within, like from an instructor view, that they can kind of maybe preload some of the learning content and the learning instruction, especially if they're in like a self-paced or a like semester-long course. If they want to like rewrite announcements and then set them on a date release, just so that's a little less lift that an instructor has to do during a semester when they're trying to, grade everything. It's really just kind of making the learning kind of contained and simplified for your users, so both your students and your instructor, and then from the back end for the administrator to really make it easy to gather the data reports and make sure that people are being managed efficiently.
Right. And there's so many cool things that are happening in LMSs, right? Now they're including some social features, some gamification, which will like explain a little bit more about what that means. And you can, there's a lot of different elements that are being added onto the learning management systems more than there ever was before. So
yeah,
those are fun. Okay. The next thing that we're going to talk about is xAPI, which always sounds a little intimidating to some people. So let's break it down.
So an xAPI is an e-learning specification that allows one to collect data about a wide range of experiences a person has, whether it's online or offline training. The one example that I really like to use is Amazon and Google have APIs for translations in their open source code. So you can take the APIs and add them into like Articulate Storyline, which like we talked about is an authoring tool to automatically translate your content from one language to another. So if you have an Articulate project, that's separate from a website. So you wouldn't really be able to use, like if you were on Chrome, you'd be able to just like use Google Translate and translate it from, say English to French. Whereas in a authoring tools exported package, you wouldn't really be able to do that. But if you added the API in when you're building out the storyline, and then you package it up and you put it in your LMS, then your users have the option of translating it.
That's very cool. That is a very good example of xAPI. And it sounds like very easy. It's very relatable to understand that. I think there's really, what else can we say about xAPIs, right? So I think you've summed it up nicely. Anything else would just be confusing.
So xAPI also used to be known as like the tin can API. So that's, learning record store. So that's, it all takes into account all these different, kind of things that the programming that a lot of us don't really get into. But it's like, as my husband always says, it's just enough programming to be dangerous.
Right. And there's opportunities, of course, if you get into it, you can go and learn more about xAPI, but usually you don't run into it unless you have a very specific goal in mind, and then you realize, oh, I can only accomplish this goal if I have specific triggers that I can add to it, like the who did what and what was done, and then who was it done to. When you had to add like those different layers of triggers to the learning management system that talks from, like you said, in-person activities and also online activities, then you're going to need the xAPI.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And then in a learning management system, sometimes you'll see like an xAPI or an LTI used to integrate like a third-party software. So for example, in D2L, if I wanted to put in test out content, I can get an LTI link from them and just integrate it on the back end. And it's like, it acts like a single sign-on, like it's one system. So your students don't really notice that you're pushing them out to a third party.
Oh yeah, that's right. Yeah, a lot of APIs are used just in regular software, besides even when we're talking about training, right? So like, just like you said, the single sign-on. So say you have to sign on to your, what's that Microsoft site that you use in corporate? SharePoint. And then sometimes they'll have your login to SharePoint also be the same login that you use for your learning management system, even though it's a different site.
Mm-hmm.
And it's all connected through this thing called API.
Yeah. For example, like, and then to like piggyback off of that, like there's SIS, which is a student information system. So at a lot of institutions, mostly like colleges and universities, you'll have a student information system, which houses like the registration information, their financial information, and then, that kind of pushes it out to like their email systems and, any of the internal software that the university uses, and then usually their LMS. So that way they just like log into like a student portal and they can access all that information without having to log in multiple times. It's all about, creating that positive user experience.
Right. And so, of course, we're going to include all these terms that we're talking about and their definitions in our show notes. But so we've started with the online learning part and all those terms that you hear. And what's important about these terms is, one, because they are, in our industry, but two, if you have to go for an interview, sometimes, and a lot of times, a lot of these different terms that we're discussing will be brought up in your interview. So it's always good to know your industry language. All right, let's move on to some fun stuff like instructional methods.
So we've got under here microlearning, which I always kind of chuckle at because everybody thinks that, microlearning is like this huge thing right now. It's really just a buzzword for ways of, really honing down your content into brief, targeted learning objects that are less than like 3 to 6 minutes. Robin noted, like, we've got all these little nuggets and, they can be connected or they can be standalone. Thinking about it, there was a study published by Google where like our attention spans, because of, how everything's becoming so mobilely accessible, that our attention spans are like 4 minutes. You've got 4 minutes to like tell people what they want to know when they want to know it. Otherwise, they're gone. We're just like switching our mindsets from Facebook to email to all these different things. Every 4 minutes, we're just switching gears. So that's really where the push of microlearning is coming out. So one of the examples I really like to use is the BuzzFeed Tasty videos.
I love those.
So they're 60 seconds to like 5 minutes. And they just like, they're like the camera's overhead and it just like shoots them like going through a recipe. And it just like tells you like all the like tips and tricks and like gives you the whole recipe in like 60 seconds.
And it's so, I don't know why it's so compelling to just watch them pour ingredients in a bowl. And then like,
right.
it's like an instant cake. The cake is ready in 60 seconds. It's so satisfying.
Like I was watching one the other day with like cream cheese and they were making like a cream cheese frosting. And I'm like, oh, you got to get a mixer out. And they just like started mixing it with a whisk. And I was just like, I wouldn't do that. I would use a mixer. That's the point.
Your cream cheese would have to be really soft
To mix it with like a hand whisk. Like,
yeah.
I'm like, those poor people.
But it's also a good example of yes, microlearning, but also giving people only the information that they need in order to accomplish some kind of goal or result or like whatever it is that they want to know, instead of being like, and then you get out the mixer and then you take the eggs and you crack them. Like, it's like, no, you just cut that stuff out. Be like, boom, 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 cake, ding. And that's
right.
And people are happy to learn that way. And that's another reason why microlearning is so effective. But like you said, it's not that new, because people have been creating short information bites for a long time. It just maybe hasn't always been in video format.
Right. And it's like, and then you think about it from like, all your like kind of like help guides. Like once, they create these videos, it's really easy to go back in and like grab the screenshot and then just write out the instructions. And then at any point in the process, you could just like reference it.
Right.
Without having to go rewatch the video. So it just kind of like gives people a way to really like pinpoint their learning instead of like having to sit through like this ginormous thing.
Exactly. Okay. And the next thing we have is game-based learning and gamification. And I bring them both up at the same time because there's a lot of confusion about both of them and if there's even a distinction.
Right. So game-based learning, to me, I'm just going to preface this with, to me, game-based learning is when you're learning within a game. There was like a big wave probably about 10 years ago to use like Second Life as part of like, game-based learning. Whereas gamification applies game mechanics to something that clearly is not a game.
Right. I actually wrote my dissertation on gamification of corporate training. And it was because it's so funny that you brought up Second Life. I thought I was going to write it about, like these like massive online player games. And then it like evolved into gamification. And it's because you don't have to build an entire game, which is game-based learning, like you said, in order to make learning effective with game elements. And what's interesting about, I'm kind of going on a tangent now, but what's interesting about gamification is that you can pull out the elements of games like points, levels, leaderboards, storytelling, narrative, and all those kinds of things, and you can apply it to maybe microlearning or whatever it is, and then you can drive specific behaviors, right? Because if you give somebody like an entire game-based learning, they could be in that game, and they could be in that game because their motivation is to play the game, and then maybe learning happens as kind of like a secondary item. But if you use gamification elements, like say you put points on something that increases learning retention, right? So say time on task, that increases learning retention. And so you give somebody points to stay longer on a task in your course. And so that means that you are using these gamification elements to drive behaviors that increase learning effectiveness. And that's why gamification is being used more and more in instructional design.
Right. And let's just be really clear here. Gamification is about, changing people's behavior.
Yeah.
Whereas it's not just, taking your training and then taking your old like PowerPoint certificates and then turning them into badges. That's not what we're doing here. You're really looking at incentivizing people to change their behavior.
Right. And even like concentrate on specific behaviors, right?
Right.
Yeah, that's good.
Like an example is companies that give their employees Fitbits and then they incentivize them So like they'll give them a goal for points for the quarter, and then they'll let employees create challenges, like to get out and walk over the weekend and see who gets the most steps, because the person who's in first gets an extra 200 points. So it's really like incentivizing them to lead a healthier lifestyle.
That's great. All right, so let's get off of games because I could go on and on. Let's go to instructional design models.
So my jam is definitely backwards design, or understanding by design, UBD, which is really a method for setting goals before choosing the instructional methods and forms of assessments. It really starts by identifying the desired results and then determining the acceptable evidence, and then you plan your learning experiences and instructional methods off of those needs.
Right. And that's pretty much how it's, I mean, that's the standard now for instructional design, right? Everyone should be starting with the end goal. Like, what are the final outcomes that you want for your lesson or your course or whatever, right? Or
Yeah.
action mapping is another term for it, but it is all, most instructional designers are using the backwards like design.
Yeah, I think it's just easier and it's more straightforward to really ask yourself the question of, what do you really want your student to be able to do after, a module or after they take a course? Like, what do you want them to be able to do in their field? And really, like, what do you want them to take away from the course? Because if it's just, writing a paper for writing a paper's sake, that's not really going to have as much value as doing something a little bit more dynamic and analytical.
Unless, of course, you are an English major and you have to get better at writing. So then that's when you should be writing papers. But man, anytime you go through any kind of higher education experience, you have to write so many papers.
Yeah, and it's just like, I think that's like everybody's like default mode of like, let's just throw in a paper, instead of like, maybe thinking a little bit outside of our go-to boxes.
Right. So we'll try not to get onto a tangent about how higher education prepares instructional designers. We'll we'll leave that alone for some other time. All right. There's another model that's kind of gaining a lot of popularity. Well, just in at least the circles that I've seen, and it's called it's been around for a long time, but it's called the 70-20-10 model. And
I've actually never heard of this model.
Really?
So yes, I'm actually really intrigued.
Okay, so I've been seeing it a lot. And so basically what it means is that 70% of our actual learning comes from new experiences. And a lot of those new experiences are like when we are applying information, or when we're making mistakes out in the world, or when we're just trying to figure things out for ourselves. That's where a lot of our learning comes from. And you can see this like when you're like raising kids and you see little babies, and they're just like little scientists walking around, trying to get reactions from things. And so that's where 70% of our learning comes from. Then 20% is learning from others. And so that's like social learning, getting feedback, our teachers, that kind of stuff. And then it says only 10% from courses and materials. And that means everything. And so this has been around for a while. I didn't put it in my notes like the exact year, so I'll put in the show notes or something. But this is why, especially in corporate training, instructional designers keep talking about the 70-20-10 model, because they say like, why are we keeping people in courses for so long when what they really need is like hands-on training? They need the experience of learning on the job and things like that. That's why I think it comes up a lot in corporate training.
Yeah, that's really cool, because it's like thinking about it from, giving people the training that they need when they need it, instead of like plopping them in like a self-paced course where they're going to be in there for 6 months and they might not learn something in time to apply it on their job. So then that affects their job performance, and then, their job reviews.
Right. Exactly. Right. So there are several other models in instructional design, but we just wanted to give some of the popular ones that are kind of circulating right now. So let's move on to instructional design methods. Hey, before we go on to like models and methods, maybe we should define kind of the difference between a model and a method. And so for me, a model is just kind of like an ideal based on, of course, there's research and whatever that goes into it. And then a method is how you apply the theories. It's like the practice of a discipline. Would you agree with those? Like kind of,
Yeah.
that's how you'd separate them?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, anyway you slice it, it's really like you're cherry picking from a method or a model, and kind of applying it. Because really, when you're approaching whatever you're building, sometimes it's helpful to not really be married to one specific model. Sometimes, you might use UBD versus other times you might need a more agile approach. Or you might end up using a mix of both.
Right. And in our categories, those fall into different, right? The UBD is a model and Agile would be a method. Yeah. Okay. But you do need both, right? You do need to be aware of both whenever you're creating curriculum, like a method and a model.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, a lot of us, when it comes to instructional design methods, we're really familiar with the ADDIE model. That I know for a fact was developed by the Navy. That's how that came out in like the 1950s. It rolled out because they wanted to standardize how all of their boot camps were.
Fascinating.
Yeah. That's like my tiny little ADDIE model tidbit. So ADDIE stands for Analysis, Design, Development, Implementation, and Evaluation. So those are kind of the different stages that you go through with ADDIE. Similar models to that include Dick and Carey, but Dick and Carey allows for revisions, whereas ADDIE is much more of a start to finish kind of process. And then we move into SAM. Robin, have you developed using SAM at all?
I think that no is my answer, but I think that you kind of do develop according to SAM on accident in many ways, especially like as you kind of go along and you see, oh, well, I need to have some kind of prototype for my stakeholders. And so you give it to them and then they give you feedback and then you kind of do a reiteration to develop the training in a different way based on their feedback sometimes, or you keep going forward. So a lot of times SAM happens on accident. And just like I always thought that I was like, diehard ADDIE, but I don't always think that ADDIE's always like a waterfall method either. But according to definitions, they say like, oh, it's always linear. But that hasn't been my case, even though like that's always in my mind is analysis, design, development, and so forth. But because of if you're integrating feedback into your process and your design, then it seems almost as if you follow some of the other models that are called Agile, even though you might not realize it specifically.
Yeah. So then like Agile comes from the project management term where you're working in sprints, and they're typically like 2-week sprints. So you'll design and develop something and you'll roll it out and then you'll move on to the next phase, but you'll eventually like swing back and do the kind of the revision of the process while you keep like working ahead. So if you're developing milestones within your course development, so you're working on like say modules 1 and 2 and you roll those out for review, and then during that time, like 2-week time of review for your key stakeholders, you might be working on modules 3 and 4. And then as you get feedback on the first 2 modules, you might be integrating that feedback. And it's just kind of like keeps the process moving forward.
Have you ever actually done an agile model applied to instructional design where you roll out some kind of two-week prototype sprint to your learners? Have you ever actually done that?
Not formally.
Right.
I'm working on a project now that's very similar. It's kind of applying the agile model using backwards design for the instructional design model. But in terms of like the agile, if you were to do it during a live course development, it really feels like you're running in front of the train. That means that you've got like 2 weeks of content in your LMS. And like you see this in a lot of colleges who are just like now starting to launch their learning management systems. So their instructors may not be like as, familiar with the LMS. So they're just like, they're putting content in, kind of a week before the students even need to like start learning it. So that's really like where an agile model can kind of be a hindrance, because sometimes it seems like there's no plan.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if I'm like an expert to talk about agile, but it seems like, not only that, it's like, that just seems crazy because I've worked on a client project where we were only a week ahead of the learners, and it's not necessarily agile because it's supposed to be, from what I understand, it's supposed to be that you have you do a sprint and you roll that out, and then you're supposed to get feedback, and then you do another sprint on that same module to kind of bring in their feedback and make it better. That's what I understand, and I've never actually seen that happen. And I know it happens a lot for application development for like in IT worlds, but I haven't experienced or seen anybody do it in that way in the course development.
I think it would be really hard to do it in the course development. You might be able to address it from like a college or university standpoint, like an instructor may be able to like gather that feedback, and then on like their like they could just post like a little video that like updates students if there's like pain points that they need to kind of go in and review. That could be like how you address it during a live course. But it's kind of just goes back to that whole like running in front of the train. It's like nobody likes that like anxiety feeling. So I think like, it's good from a project management perspective because you can kind of like map out what you're going to do over 2 weeks. But from a course development standpoint, of course, I had to have a notification go off. From a course development standpoint, it really, I think, is a hindrance.
Yeah, and I'm sure people are allowed to disagree with us. This is our perspective, right? And so,
yeah.
Well, let's go on to...
if Agile's your thing, more power to you.
Yeah, maybe you can explain to us how to actually apply this in a corporate training perspective, because I can't imagine like even like testing things to learners and getting them to pay attention in a corporate environment, and then they'd be like why you keep bringing back the same course to me?
Right. Like I would be freaking out. And I seem to think like that I handle like stress and like all these different like demands really well. But I feel like if I was put into an agile environment, I would be freaking out.
Wait, supposedly you get a whole team.
Supposedly.
But
all right. I'd believe it when I see it.
Yeah. We'll just all right. So you know what agile is, and I'd be surprised if you use it as an instructional designer. And if you do, let us know. Let's go on to learning experience design. And yeah, have you seen this one come around a lot in kind of your industry terms?
I have, but I haven't gotten to use it yet. I was at DevLearn over the summer, and two of the presenters were talking about a learning experience design model that they're starting to roll out that looked really interesting. But I haven't gotten to apply anything like that in current trainings.
Right. And basically what learning experience design means, it's about creating human-centered learning experiences. And you'll hear a lot of people say like learning experience design is replacing instructional design. But from what I understand is that learning experience design is mostly about just the design part of whenever you're doing instructional design. And it's about thinking about your learner and your avatar and, getting feedback from them and kind of the process that you go through before you ever start really designing or developing the full course. It's about getting in front of the learners and finding out, what is going to be like the most helpful for them in the context that it'll be applied to. Is that how you understood it?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and so it just, it kind of includes a lot more upfront analysis, if you will, but it's all, more audience interviews or observations, or sometimes even bringing the learners in to co-create with you. And so this can happen even in the corporate environment too. So that's learning experience design. It won't replace instructional design. It just says, hey, like, think about the learners more at the very beginning of whatever you're going to create.
Right. It's like, how are they accessing the content? And then, what is kind of the content that they really need to learn?
All right. So let's move from the methods, to just like, who are all these project team members and like some of the names that are given to people whenever you're creating a course. And some of these titles are for, I don't know, are they used globally, like stakeholder? Do you have stakeholders when you, I guess you do.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, like
Yeah.
deans in the higher education space would be a stakeholder of a course.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you think about your stakeholders, you have like both internal and external stakeholders. Stakeholders is a very like project management term. So, your internal stakeholders, if you're working at a university, are your deans, your academic advisors, kind of all the people that you need to kind of touch base with throughout like the development of a course. Your external stakeholders could be they're obviously your students. But they could also be, if you're working as a subcontractor, they could be your client. Who's really going to take ownership of the training once you've kind of built it. That can be one of your external stakeholders. My example here is over the summer I did an LMS migration. So I was kind of part of a project team. So I had both my internal and my external stakeholders. So that could be like the director of IT was an internal stakeholder, whereas my external stakeholders were the implementation team from Brightspace.
There you go. And in a corporate, the stakeholders are usually your executives or the VPs. And then also you have stakeholders who could be managers of the people that you're going to deliver the training to. Several different people could be stakeholders. It's whoever is kind of in charge of your course or your training project.
Right. And then like you've got your SME, who are your subject matter experts. So they really have like the field and the knowledge area to really provide you with the content. As instructional designers, we're not content experts, we're learning experts. So we know how to package everything up to make it be a successful learning experience.
Right. And so in order to do that, we have to work in partnership with our subject matter experts. And so sometimes that means, in the corporate environment, if you have a subject matter expert, they are your subject matter expert, but they have another job to do usually. Like their job is not to be a subject matter expert. Whereas my experience in creating university curriculum is you have a subject matter expert who is that because they have a PhD in that field, and that is their job, is to just focus on being your subject matter expert.
Hold on a sec. I got to email the school real quick.
Oh, because are you late?
I will be in 8 minutes, but it's okay.
We're at the end.
I know. And I know you can cut this part out, so I'm hoping that my typing didn't show up. I was just emailing the school secretary. So subject matter expert. So it's a partnership between the two. And sometimes I've worked with SMEs who kind of don't really understand the role of an instructional designer. So sometimes, being upfront with them that they're really the content expert, that's their kind of like their baby. And sometimes they have like a very big ego when it comes to that content. So sometimes some people just need reassurance that you're not there to really, step on their feet in terms of the content. You're really just there to kind of help them mold and shape that to be able to teach it more effectively.
Right. And we could go on and on about how to work with subject matter experts, but that's another topic.
Right. Like that can be a whole thing on its own.
Well, that just kind of brings us to like e-learning developer or content developer, which we have in there. And so, but that's different from what you just said about the subject matter expert, right?
Right. So an e-learning developer or content developer is usually responsible for creating the visual and graphic design, or like the course content layouts, basically the presentation of content and information to the learners, especially if it's, in meaningful and engaging ways. These are your infographics, your videos, the storylines and captivate learning objects, and so on.
And then we have an e-learning specialist or an online content strategist.
So these positions focus on the designing, developing, and evaluating an e-learning or online content. They usually look at it from a course or program level. So these are kind of your people who plan out your content in terms of like, a course program. So if you're looking at it from an academic perspective, if you're going to roll out a program in entrepreneurship, what are the courses that would go under that, and kind of parsing them out in ways that are meaningful and effective, and then thinking about how your current teaching and assessment methods would get deployed, reviewing customer surveys, and then, suggesting ways that you can innovate or improve a course or program's materials that really makes it engaging and scalable.
Right. So basically, like, they are really good at making learning paths.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Just keep it simple. And then
keep it simple.
Just keeping it simple. And then our last and final category, and then we will stop peppering you with all these instructional design terms. We have blended or hybrid learning. And really all this is, and I'm just going to summarize this, is that a blended learning means that there is an online component and an on-site component. So you may have heard of the flipped classroom, and basically what that means is somebody goes and they take an online course where they learn the information that usually a teacher would lecture on in the classroom, but then they use the face-to-face or the on-site instruction for group activities, or they use it to ask questions and get live feedback. So that is an example of blended learning or hybrid learning. It's just a combination of online and in-person training or course design.
And then you've got your instructional systems design, which is a fun way of, saying instructional design. It's usually used by the military or government training. You'll see a lot of programs that are like educational technology. Penn State just renamed their program to learning, design, and technology from instructional systems, just to kind of update it with a more current term.
Yeah, and you'll see the acronym is ISD. But usually, if in my experience, if I ever see instructional systems designer, it's always applied to some kind of instructional design for the military. I don't see it a lot in corporate job boards, but if you're searching all the key terms, might as well throw that one in there.
Yep. I still abbreviate it as ISD in like every email.
You do?
And, yeah, and every like if I'm doing a project board or something, like and I'm mapping out like whose responsibility it is, I'll put ISD next to it instead of ID.
Haha, I see. I hear the little kid. Okay. And then the next one is what is a module? A lot of people kind of use modules and lessons and course and all those kinds of things. They use them interchangeably, but usually what people mean by a module is like it's like the larger topic, and then a lesson is a piece of that topic that you're going to learn. So module 1 can have 10 lessons, module 2 have 5 lessons, and so forth. Right? Most people are familiar with module. We just threw it in there.
Yeah. Module is like a lesson.
Wait.
Objective versus an outcome. One of them is usually more associated with a goal, where like an objective, what you hope to learn, an outcome, what students will be able to do at the end of the course or at the end of a module.
Right. And so we have learning outcomes and learning objectives. And learning objectives, so say for instance, if you are writing a lesson, then you will write learning objectives just for that lesson. And they get really specific and really narrow, and they use verbs, and usually measurable verbs, for what you want the students to do, or hopefully do in that course or that lesson. And then the outcomes is like, what do you want somebody to be able to do at the end of all your modules or all your courses? Like if you have a group of them, those are usually your outcomes.
Yeah. So usually it just, depends on, sometimes it depends on the ID who's developing it. Sometimes it depends on the content as to whether you would use one or the other.
And since we're talking about objectives and outcomes, then we have to mention Bloom's taxonomy. There are other ones, but this is like the main one that you got to know. And and Bloom's taxonomy is basically a system of verbs that start at the simple and go all the way to the complex to describe learning objectives. And you use these verbs and you should use the measurable ones, but you use these verbs in the Bloom's taxonomy to write your learning objectives so that so if you say somebody is able to analyze the data in a chart and determine if the company is, successful or whatever. I guess you say something more specific, like profitable. That's the word I'm looking for. then you know that you have to take them through in your course. They have to actually perform that action. And that's kind of what Bloom's taxonomy is finding those verbs so that you can measure their success and then applying them in your actual course. There's more to say about Bloom's taxonomy if you want.
Right. CELT has a CELT. I think they're Indiana University. They have a really good resource that goes through kind of Bloom's taxonomy from the different domains, so like the cognitive and psychomotor, as well, to give you kind of examples of how you can really apply the hierarchy to the different ways that you might want your students to be measured when it comes to the assessment.
Right. And just the one last sentence, for Bloom's taxonomy, just one more sentence for Bloom's taxonomy it is a hierarchical ordering of cognitive skills that can, among countless other uses, help teachers teach and students learn. And that's just like the one sentence definition I thought was useful. And our last and final final term for you is storyboarding. So this one's pretty easy, right? Storyboarding, this is what you do before you develop the final or a version of the iteration of your course. And it's usually used for online learning courses. You'll create a storyboard where you take your script and you map it out in some kind of storyboard. And this could even be something that you just write on a piece of paper and draw things, or you can put it in a PowerPoint. There's a storyboard template on my website, or you can, there's several other tools that you can use where you just map out what you want the narration to say, what you want on the screen, and you are designing what the screen should look like, and you storyboard every single screen. And you do this so that you can see like the big picture and move things around before you get into the heavy lifting of the development work of an online course.
Right. And like sometimes what will end up happening is a lot of us end up using like a blueprint to start, and that's kind of your hierarchy of your course. And then you move out to the storyboards, or you can just have them be one big massive document. But your storyboards really come into play when you're trying to put it up onto an LMS, or you're trying to build out your Articulate or Captivate project.
That's right, because you do storyboard for university courses too, right? When you do write that blueprint, that's like a storyboard.
Yeah, then like if you're doing like a course in Blackboard, you might map out like what are all your items, you know, what are your assignments, and then you can put in your instructions and your settings. So that way when it comes down the road to like revise the course, they know what the settings are, they know what, you know, they might have to tweak, and then they have like a document, because you never know, you could end up migrating from, you know, one LMS to another, and you could end up losing your content. So then you have kind of this ancillary document that really houses the course in addition to having it on an LMS.
We did it. We got through all the terms listed in our Google Doc.
Like, it's like if I'm sure that there are like a million others that we didn't cover, but we figured these were the awesomest ones.
Yeah, they're the most awesome, the most widely used, and people throw them out there like everyone should know what they're talking about.
Which may or may not always be the case, but hopefully now everybody knows.
Yeah, it's like we just kind of hung out and read the dictionary to you.
What we do.
That's what we do. We didn't even make it micro-learning at all. But we did make it mobile, because you can just carry this podcast around with you. So there you go.
I mean, you could technically go and chunk all of these into little bite-sized blips.
Yeah. Would you like to hear me say mobile learning?
Completing the podcast.
That's it. And Rachel, thank you so much for coming on here with me. I'm definitely going to have you on future. So we already have like 2 other topics that we're going to like come talk about, but
yeah,
I'm so happy to have you. So do you have any last thing you'd want to tell somebody who wants to become an idol?
If you want to become an idol, I am so happy that I made my like career shift from video production. I still get to do some of that. So I didn't know how many different things like are involved in instructional design. So if it's not your background to be in education, like don't ever have any type of fear or doubt. Like you can totally pick up these, especially like if you've got good analytical skills and creative thinking skills, like this is really like my jam. So I really I wish everybody like the best of luck if, you know, you're thinking about making the career change. It's definitely a really fun field to be in.
Amen. Amen. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Rachel Hudish. We really appreciate you.
Thanks for having me, Robin.
All right. Talk to you soon. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much for listening. You can find the show notes for this episode at idlecourses.com. If you like this podcast and you want to become an instructional designer and online learning developer, join me in the Idle Courses Academy, where you'll learn to build all the... If you like this podcast and you want to become an instructional designer and online learning developer, Join me in the Idle Courses Academy, where you'll learn to build all the assets you'll need to land your first job, early access to this podcast, tutorials for how to use the e-learning authoring tools, templates for everything course building, and paid instructional design experience opportunities. You can sign up for the waitlist at idlecourses.com. Now get out there and build transcendent courses.